There are a lot of reasons that men are falling behind in this country, but a look at the numbers reveals one statistic that tracks the decline of American men almost precisely over time: the disappearance of fathers from the home. Between 1960 and 2016, the proportion of kids living with both parents decreased by almost 20%. The percentage of children living with only their mothers nearly tripled. In demographic terms, this is stunning. Changes to family structure this abrupt and profound typically are only seen in wartime. And yet, if anything, those numbers understate the reality of fatherlessness in America. In the high-income neighborhoods where journalists and policymakers tend to live, not a lot has changed. Most kids there still grow up with their fathers and mothers. But in the rest of the country, intact families are disappearing. According to a 2014 study by researchers at Johns Hopkins University, among younger parents without college degrees, 74% of mothers had at least one child outside of marriage. Out-of-wedlock births are now the rule across the country, not the exception. Increasingly, having a father at home is a sign of affluence, but it is also a cause of affluence, especially for boys. Boys who grow up with a father at home earn much more as adults. Boys who grow up alone with their mothers tend to earn less. They also have more disciplinary problems in school. They read less and less well. They're less likely to graduate from high school or go to college. They are more likely to be unemployed and to live in poverty. They get married less often, and when they do, they divorce more. They're more likely to be obese and to have asthma. They are far more likely to abuse alcohol and drugs, exhibit antisocial behavior, and commit acts of violence. As adults, they're twice as likely to go to prison. Now, these numbers aren't the result of one study, but of numerous large studies done over generations. The results hold true across geography and ethnic groups, white and black, urban and rural. They're always true. Boys raised without their fathers are at terrible risk. There is not much serious academic debate about that, if any. The nationwide breakup of families is a disaster, and not just a moral disaster, but a practical one. It may be the largest public health crisis that we face. So what's driving it? Well, there are many factors. Falling male wages certainly play a role. Studies show that when men make less than women in their potential dating pool, women tend to consider them less attractive marriage partners. Fewer men marry, more children are born out of wedlock. Some government policies also discourage marriage, particularly among the poor. Women on welfare who marry often see their food and housing subsidies cut dramatically. One recent report found that almost 1/3 of Americans know someone who hasn't married for fear of losing benefits. When was the last time you heard a Democratic office holder decry the out-of-wedlock birth rate? If you cared about reducing poverty, you would talk about it a lot, but they don't. Why is that? Well, exit polling answers that question. Unmarried mothers are a critical part of the Democratic coalition. In 2008, Barack Obama won 74% of single mothers who voted. In 2012, he won 75%. Alienating these voters in any way is politically risky for Democrats, and so they ignore the problem entirely. Over time, the progressive left has become openly hostile to the institution of marriage. Once again, voting patterns explain why. It's been more than 20 years since a Democrat running for president won the majority of married women in America. Unmarried women, by contrast, vote overwhelmingly for Democrats. In 2012 and 2016, the Democratic Party platform never mentioned the importance of marriage except when advocating for gay marriage. In 2013, as she was preparing to run for president, Hillary Clinton shot a video tribute to single mothers. Quote, "Single moms are the real heroines," she said. "They need even more of the help that grandparents, aunts and uncles, and good friends can provide." The one group that Hillary didn't mention? Biological fathers. Democrats who stray from this script tend to get attacked. Barack Obama spoke regularly and often eloquently about the importance of fatherhood. And yet, consistent with his party's orthodoxy, he said almost nothing about men marrying the mothers of their children. And that distinction is critical. Studies show that married fathers are by far most involved in their children's lives. You often hear our leaders refer to caring parents or grandparents or caregivers or some similar combination, as if the presence of any involved adult is enough for kids. But that's not true. At least for boys, the presence of a biological father in the house makes all the difference. On at least one occasion, Obama suggested that he understood this. In a 2003 speech about gun violence he gave in Chicago, Obama noted that, quote, "we should do more to promote marriage." Almost immediately, he was attacked from the left. An article in Ebony magazine suggested that Obama's remarks were racist. MSNBC ran an op-ed attacking him, and so on. He went back to platitudes. Dr. Warren Farrell has looked into this subject quite closely. He's the author of the book, The Boy Crisis, and he joins us tonight. Dr. Farrell, thanks a lot for coming on. So we know pretty conclusively that men in America and in other developed countries are falling behind women in a lot of different measures. To what extent is fatherlessness driving that, do you think?
A great extent. They're falling behind women in all 63 leading nations, developed nations. And in developed nations, there's the permission for divorce that there isn't in non-developed, less developed nations. And also in developed nations, there's the permission for women to marry, to have children without being married. And that creates a huge division between boys and a division of boys who are with their fathers do quite well. Boys who are not with their fathers do terribly on more than 70 different measures of measures like postponed gratification, the ability to be, whether or not they're depressed, whether or not they're drinking, whether or not they have drugs, the opioid crisis, and even the people who are involved as ISIS recruits all over the world, they're almost completely fatherless boys, and the ones that are girls are also fatherless. When we tell the biological father, not only are you important, but the way that you father is important. The way that you enforce boundaries, the way that you encourage exploration, the way that you encourage kids to get up and try again, the way that you encourage adventure and risk-taking, the way that that we can play together and create bonds. These are the things that mothers need to communicate, because when fathers are asked for and valued, they come back into the picture. When they're not, they drop out. I think we put so much focus, especially in the Democratic Party, on freedom for women. And freedom for women is a wonderful thing. I was in the board of directors of the National Organization for Women in New York City, as you know, for many years. But freedom for women stops when they make the free choice to have children. And then a different question has to emerge, which is what is best for the children.
The most remarkable fact about the decline of men in America is how relentlessly our leaders pretend it's not happening at all. The patriarchy is thriving, they tell us. Men are in charge, and they succeed precisely to the extent they thwart the progress of women. Society is a zero-sum equation in which a man's gain is a woman's loss. This is wrong, and we must rectify it. That's the message. Those also happen to be the core assumptions of second-wave feminism, which became popular 40 years ago, just as many of our baby boom leaders were coming of age. And yet none of those assumptions are true today. America has changed completely. The patriarchy is gone. Women are winning. Men are failing. Men in America are now far more likely to die of a drug overdose, drop out of the workforce because of an addiction, commit a felony, and go to prison. They fail in school much more often than women do. They kill themselves at many times the rate. Overall, they die years younger. Those numbers are not speculative. They are hard data gathered over decades by nonpartisan researchers. You'd have to ignore a huge amount of settled science in order to repeat the pieties of 1970s-era feminism. And yet that is exactly what our leaders continue to do. In March of 2009, almost immediately after arriving in Washington, Barack Obama created the White House Council on Women and Girls. He tapped his advisor, Valerie Jarrett, to run it. Quote, "When our daughters don't have the same education and career opportunities as our sons," Obama said in his announcement, "that affects our economy and our future as a nation." At the very moment Obama was lamenting the lack of educational opportunities for women, more girls than boys were graduating from high school. Far more were graduating from college. Women now earn 62% of associate's degrees, 57% of bachelor's degrees, 60% of master's degrees, and 52% of doctorates. That gap is even wider in non-white neighborhoods. For example, in 2007, among black and Hispanic graduates of public schools in Boston, for every 100 black men who got a college degree, there were 230 black women who got one. For every 100 Hispanic men who got a college degree, there were 211 Hispanic women who got one. 70% of all master's degrees awarded to black students nationally went to black women. Just 30% went to black men. Yet, for reasons the Obama administration never explained, the school performance of black and Hispanic girls was deemed a higher priority than the performance of black and Hispanic boys. Under Obama, the White House solicited hundreds of millions of dollars from corporations to encourage female achievement in higher education. At the time this was happening, one study showed that there were already at least 4 times as many privately funded college scholarships available for girls as for boys. 4 times. The administration never acknowledged this. Instead, it sought new ways to close a gender gap that no longer exists. One idea was, quote, breaking down gender stereotypes in toys. To that end, the White House pressured manufacturers, retailers, and media outlets to eliminate gender distinction in children's toys. This, the administration claimed, would allow kids to, quote, explore, learn, and dream without limits. Well, educators at all levels took this idea seriously. In 2015, one kindergarten teacher in Washington state banned her male students from playing with Lego. Fitting together plastic blocks has been found by researchers to help children develop important cognitive skills. Boys have enough advantages, the teacher explained, so she intentionally prevented them from learning. Girls thrive when boys fail. This is the underlying assumption of much of America's gender policy and education. There is no credible research to suggest that is true. It is purely an ideological belief. And yet that assumption is pervasive, especially on college campuses. Now, that's ironic because there are more than 2 million more women than men enrolled in college this year. On most campuses, men are a distinct minority. At Carlow University in Pittsburgh, women outnumber men by more than 6 to 1. And yet almost every campus has a women's studies department. In many of them, the stated goal is to fight expressions of masculinity and disempower men. At Ohio State, a course is underway this spring called Be a Man: Masculinities, Race, and Nation. The syllabus for that course explains that masculinity is used to, quote, justify certain kinds of violence by men. On the first day of class, students were required to consult a male privilege checklist. At Duke University in North Carolina, a 9-week workshop met to devise ways to undermine, quote, masculinity and maleness, as well as to create destabilized spaces for those with privilege, meaning men. Similar projects have sprouted at colleges all over the country. Under the Obama administration, the Department of Justice created something called the Healthy Masculinity Campus Athletics Project. The coordinator of that program at Wheaton College summed up its objective this way, quote, as a country, we need to do a better job of addressing issues around toxic masculinity. Left unasked was the most basic question of all. Is masculinity itself really toxic? And what happens to boys when we tell them that it is? It's widely understood that attacking people for their basic nature is unhealthy, and it's wrong. A government-funded program designed to fight toxic femininity or toxic homosexuality probably would not escape the scrutiny of Congress or the media. At the very least, its supporters would have to explain why our country needs a program like that. And yet nobody has been forced to explain why boys, who are already failing, need to be held back further. Christina Hoff Sommers is the author of The War Against Boys. She was one of the very first people in American intellectual life to notice this trend and to sound the alarm. She was ignored, but we're grateful that she did it anyway. Thank you. Christina Hoff Sommers joins us tonight. So you wrote this original piece from which this whole series basically has been derived almost 20 years ago when you noticed that boys were falling behind. And yet the assumptions of the people who make policy decisions don't seem to have changed much in that time. Why?
There's a great deal of resistance to addressing the needs of boys. And there are a lot of women's groups, not all of them, but most of them call it backlash. And they're unwilling to listen. So boys, it's as if we've thrown the gender switch, and boys are on the wrong side of the gender gap in education.
How does that, so the core assumption is that it's a zero-sum arrangement where when you hold back boys, girls shoot ahead and it's great for them. But that's not really the nature of life, is it? Does it help girls when boys fail?
That is the fundamental fallacy. See, I think too many of the activist groups think that there's a trophy, and either Venus is going to win or Mars, and their job is to root for Venus and make sure, hold back Mars. No, there's not a single trophy. Men and women, boys and girls, we're in this together. Yes. And if boys are in trouble, so are we all. I mean, these are the young men with whom our daughters and granddaughters are going to make the future. And so if boys are failing, what's going to happen to girls?